Hello and welcome to the latest edition of The Straight Explains, which looks at the new gambling reforms set to be passed into law in Australia this week. Australia is about to introduce its biggest gambling advertising reforms ever, but have they struck the right balance? The new laws have the support from both major political parties, but while the government says the changes will protect vulnerable Australians, the betting industry has warned they could push gamblers towards illegal offshore websites, and gambling harm advocates want the measures to go further. So, what has happened to date? Communications Minister Annika Wells and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese have unveiled the changes to gambling advertising laws, and they passed through the House of Representatives on Tuesday night. They expected to go through the Senate relatively comfortably in the next couple of days. The reforms amend the Interactive Gambling Act. Albanese has called it the most significant gambling advertising reform by any Australian government. Among the key advertising changes, gambling advertising blackout will now, before live sport, will now expand from 5 minutes to 15 minutes. Restrictions will start earlier in the morning, move from 6 a.m. to 5 a.m. Online streaming services will now face the same live sport advertising rules as traditional broadcasters. Celebrity endorsements for gambling will be banned. Odd-style advertisements will be prohibited. Gambling sponsorship branding will no longer appear on sporting jerseys or inside venues, with a goal to reduce exposure to gambling advertising, especially for children. The new measures brought in place include staff and affiliates from wagering companies will no longer be able to earn commissions linked to customer gambling activities. Operators cannot directly market inducements to people who recently deregistered from BetStop. That restriction lasts for 90 days after someone leaves the self-exclusion program. Betting companies must make opt-out options more visible, and there's a new advertising opt-out register called AdStop to be created, and we'll get more into that a bit later on. Albanese says the reforms target gambling harm rather than banning gambling altogether. The government argues the changes focus on protecting vulnerable Australians. The reforms are intended to balance the consumer protection with the freedom of adults to choose to bet responsibly. The laws also target illegal offshore gambling websites. ACMA, Australia's communications regulator, will be giving stronger powers and stronger resources. Hosting providers may be required to block access to illegal gambling websites, and the legislation includes a formal review of those things after 3 years. However, Responsible Wagering Australia represents major licensed operators, including Sportsbet, Bet365, Betfair, Unibet, and others, have said it supports the measures that protect children and reduce gambling harm. However, it argues the final package goes much further than those objectives. Industry fears licensed operators will struggle to advertise legal regulating product to adults. RWA says despite the increased powers around illegal offshore operators, offshore gambling websites are growing rapidly and 2.5 times faster than Australia's legal wagering market. Their concern is that stricter rules on licensed operators could reduce their visibility and increase the visibility of those overseas. Offshore operators are generally outside of Australia's advertising consumer protection framework, and while they are technically allowed to advertise to Australian customers, the ability to actually enforce these restrictions is limited. There have also been questions raised around AdStop, which is the concept that has arisen only in the last few days from the federal government. AdStop is built around the fact that gambling advertising will be opt out for people. So people who choose not to receive gambling advertising will effectively have the option not to receive that and see that on online platforms. The challenge with that is how practically that will be actually imposed, and what Responsible Wagering Australia said earlier this week, that it took 4 years for them to get BetStop integrated and worked out from a federal government perspective, and this is a much more complex solution. While it works well from a policy point of view, the practical implications are yet to be worked out, and the industry remains concerned about how that will work. AdStop will probably not be launched by the January 1st deadline, which the federal government has imposed on this. More likely to be introduced much later. Exactly what that looks like and how effective that will be will remain question. But what has become evident is that the gambling industry and the wagering industry will be expected to pay for these solutions. Effectively, the government have said you have to prove that you can stop advertising, gambling advertising appearing to those who opt out. The challenge with that is obviously the solution that needs to be put in place. Look, supporters of this of the reform saying they will reduce gambling harm and limit children's exposure to betting advertisements, which is probably the political force that's driven this more than anyone else. Critics argue they may intentionally strengthen illegal offshore and gambling markets, and the real test will be whether the reforms can protect vulnerable Australians without pushing consumers towards less regulated options. As the laws pass through Parliament, that balance remains at the centre of the debate, and that debate continues. Several coalition members have crossed the floor on this so far and intend to vote against the new proposals. However, they are set to be passed into law this week. We'll keep you up to date on all the latest on the gambling reform discussions as well as everything else. And thanks for listening to The Straight Explains.